Ukraine says Russia is intensifying its attacks in eastern Ukraine. This comes as the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is visiting Kyiv today to meet with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Earlier today, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg revealed NATO nations have pledged and provided more than $8 billion in arms and military aid to Ukraine. On Wednesday, Russian President Vladimir Putin warned Western nations about intervening in the war in Ukraine.
If someone decides to intervene in the current events in Ukraine from the outside and create unacceptable strategic threats for Russia, then they must know that our response, our retaliatory strikes, will be lightning fast, quick. We have all the tools for this, such that no one else can boast of right now, and we won't brag. We will use them if needed, and everyone should know about it. We have made all the decisions on this matter.
Putin's comments come just after his foreign minister accused the United States and its allies of waging a proxy war in Ukraine. Putin also met with the UN Secretary General on Tuesday. We're joined now by Anatol Lieven, senior fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, author of numerous books on Russia and the former Soviet republics, including Ukraine and Russia. His latest piece is headlined, "The Horrible Dangers of Pushing a U.S. Proxy War in Ukraine." Explain, Anatol, what you mean by a proxy war and what is happening right now?
Well, the reason I wrote the piece was in response to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's statement that U.S. strategy is now to weaken Russia through the war in Ukraine. Basically that is what a proxy war is. The U.S. trying to use the war in Ukraine not just to defend Ukraine, but for a wider strategic objective. The worrying thing about this is that this has been accompanied by more and more statements in the US and NATO about helping Ukraine to win. Now, if that means helping Ukraine to fight Russia to a standstill, and prevent Russia conquering Ukraine, then that is, of course, completely legitimate. But there have been suggestions that winning means actually helping Ukraine to reconquer all the territory it has lost to Russia since 2014, including territory that Russia now regards as part of its national territory. That, of course, it would represent a really drastic escalation of US aims with very, very dangerous potential consequences.
Anatol, the question is whether the Americans think that a government apart from Putin's might be willing to relinquish areas, including Crimea.
Well, if they think that, they are totally wrong. If you look at Russian public opinion, if you look at the statements of basically the whole of the Russian political establishment, including, by the way, Alexei Navalny, the leader of the Russian opposition, they all now regard Crimea as part of Russian national territory. This, by the way, does seem to be supported by a very large majority of the population of Crimea, which is heavily ethnic Russian. So no, I mean, to bring about a Russian surrender of Crimea, you would have to basically destroy the Russian state. Now, at that point, the Russian threats of using nuclear missiles begin to look a little less like bluster and a little more like something that could actually happen.
And how can that be avoided, Anatol Lieven?
Well, my sense is that it's quite likely that if Russia can conquer the whole of the Donbass, which it hasn't done so far, the Russian military performance has been pretty pathetic, frankly, but if it can do that, precisely because Russia has suffered such heavy casualties, Russia might stop and offer a ceasefire and negotiations. The Ukrainian government has put forward some very sensible proposals for a peace settlement based on a treaty of neutrality and compartmentalizing the territorial issues for future discussion, and essentially moving the Ukraine war to the diplomatic field, as was done with the Turkish invasion of Cyprus 45 years ago. That, in my view, would be a much more sensible approach for the West to support. In other words, support the defense of Ukraine and Ukrainian independence and sovereignty, but not use Ukraine, for maximal either US or Ukrainian goals. Because also remember that it's one thing for Ukraine to defend its cities against Russian attack, which they've done with tremendous success and skill and courage, and of course with the help of Western weaponry. It's a very different matter for Ukraine to go onto the offensive and try to actually attack Russian dug-in positions. At that point, Ukraine itself will lose terribly in terms of casualties. But also, of course, Lloyd Austin's comments, and those of the British government as well, imply a war that will go on essentially forever, an endless war against Russia. We have to ask what that will do to Ukraine, what it will do to the world economy, and what it will do to Europe.
Anatol, on this question of weapon supply, Western weapon supplies to Ukraine, Russia has attempted to disrupt these supplies to Ukrainian territories, but they have not yet done so, for example, through supply routes in Poland. What would happen if Russia were to begin doing that?
Well, that, of course, would be an attack on a NATO member. There would then be tremendous pressure, I think, in America to launch a no-fly zone, to send the American Air Force into action in Ukraine. American planes would then be shot down and pilots killed by missile batteries based in Russia itself, which can cover most of Ukrainian territory. How long then would it be before America would start attacking those batteries in Russian territory? We would then have a situation in which the United States and Russia were, or at least the United States and NATO, were firing missiles into each other's territory. Two nuclear-armed superpowers with the ability between them to destroy humanity. That is precisely the scenario that generations of US presidents during the Cold War took very great care to avoid. Because the risks are too great. Now, that did not mean in any way sympathy with Soviet rule, Soviet oppression, communist dictatorship in Eastern Europe. It was simply a reflection of a recognition of the reality of the hideous dangers involved in a direct military confrontation with Moscow. But also, of course, Lloyd Austin's comments, and those of the British government as well, imply a war that will go on essentially forever, an endless war against Russia. We have to ask what that will do to Ukraine, what it will do to the world economy, and what it will do to Europe.